The life of Dave Alexander can be told in three numbers: 2 albums to build a revolution, 5 years to fade into silence, and 1 grave at age 27. With just 2 albums, 2 raw manifestos of chaos built on his thundering bass, he forged the very DNA of punk with the Stooges, laying the foundation for a sound that would change the world. But his reward for that creation was 5 long years of obscurity, a slow descent into alcoholism and regret after being brutally fired by the band he founded, which ended in a lonely, forgotten death. This is the story of that brutal arithmetic, a testament to how a man can be the architect of a revolution, only to die a nameless casualty before the war was even won. To truly understand the beautiful doomed trajectory of Dave Alexander, you must first immerse yourself in the world that forged him, Ann Arbor, Michigan, throughout the 1950s and 60s. This was not a place that, on paper, should have produced anything as beautifully ugly as the Stooges. It was not the sun-drenched, psychedelic dreamscape of San Francisco, nor the gritty, artistic bohemia of New York's Lower East Side. This was the American Midwest, the very heartland of the post-war dream. It was a landscape of neatly manicured suburban lawns, of Big Three auto industry prosperity radiating outwards from nearby Detroit, and of a simmering, restless, almost suffocating boredom that festered just beneath the placid surface of polite middle-class society. Ann Arbor, however, was a peculiar island in this sea of Midwestern conformity. It was a company town, but its company was the sprawling, prestigious University of Michigan. The university's presence made Ann Arbor an unlikely oasis of intellectualism, political radicalism, and liberal thought. It was a place of profound and constant contradiction. By day, you could see the picture of wholesome Eisenhower-era American optimism, station wagons in the driveways, families attending church on Sunday, the quiet dignity of a well-ordered life. But by night, in the smoky basements and dimly lit folk clubs, a different America was rehearsing. In the quiet garages of suburban homes, the polite Midwestern silence was learning how to scream. This was the world into which David Michael Alexander was born on June 3, 1947. He was an only child, brought into a modest, working-class family that seemed to embody the city's inherent contradictions. His father, a butcher, represented the town's blue-collar, get-the-job-done ethos. His mother, a clerk at a local retail store, was a part of the quiet, stable bedrock of the community. They were Catholics, but not, it seems, dogmatically so. They provided their son with a stable home, but stability is not the same thing as structure, and it is certainly not the same as supervision. From a young age, they gave their son a long, almost startlingly permissive leash, an abundance of freedom to find his own way, to become whoever he was meant to be. It was a parenting style born, perhaps of love, perhaps of exhaustion, but it would prove to be a fateful choice. From his earliest years, it was clear that Dave was different. He was not a gregarious, all-American boy. He was quiet, watchful, intensely internal. While other boys in the neighborhood were consumed with baseball and cars, Dave was building intricate worlds inside his own head. He was an observer, a kid who seemed to be studying the world from a slight, thoughtful remove. As an only child, he spent countless hours alone, becoming self-reliant, developing a rich interior life that would later manifest in unexpected ways. This isolation, this sense of being an outsider in his own life, may have been what led him to his first and most enduring vice. According to those closest to him, particularly Ron Asheton, his path into alcoholism began at the shockingly young age of 10. By the time he was a teenager, a student at Pioneer High School, he was no longer experimenting. He was a full-blown alcoholic, a 16-year-old with a disease that would stalk him for the rest of his short life. Here, the story takes a turn that is both heartbreaking and deeply revealing of the era's naivete about addiction. In a story that has become a key part of his tragic lore, it's recounted that his parents, instead of seeking help, chose to manage the problem by supplying him with alcohol and cigarettes at home. We can only speculate on their reasoning. Perhaps they believed it was a phase, a form of teenage rebellion that was better contained under their own roof than out on the streets. Perhaps they saw it as a pressure valve, a misguided attempt to help their intense, restless son let off steam in a controlled environment. Whatever the motive, it was a catastrophic act of love, or perhaps resignation. It normalized his addiction, weaving it into the very fabric of his home life. It taught him a devastating lesson that this poison was not only acceptable, but a sanctioned part of his identity. They had, with the best or most confused of intentions, taught the poison to call itself medicine. It was a lesson he would never unlearn. At Pioneer High, his orbit finally collided with others who shared his profound sense of alienation. Ron and Scott Asheton were brothers who lived nearby, two raw-nerved, tough-as-nails kids who shared Dave's disdain for authority and his burgeoning obsession with the new electrifying sounds coming from overseas. Together, they formed a small pack, a gang of outsiders finding solace and identity in their shared status as misfits. They were bound by a love of loud music and a shared contempt for the bland, predictable future that Ann Arbor seemed to offer. Dave's rebellion was not just the internal chemical kind, it was becoming performative, a public statement. The ultimate expression of this came on the very first day of what should have been his senior year of high school, in the fall of 1965. In a moment of pure, unadulterated punk rock ethos before punk rock even had a name, he made a bet with a friend. He walked into the school, dutifully attended his first class for exactly 45 minutes, and then stood up, walked out the front doors, and never came back. It was more than just dropping out. It was a piece of performance art, a symbolic and final rejection of the entire system. He was officially off the grid, a free agent in a world that demanded conformity. But to dismiss Dave Alexander as just another teenage delinquent, another burnout in the making, would be to miss the entire point of who he was. Behind the increasingly disheveled exterior, behind the fog of alcohol, a formidable and fiercely curious intellect was at work. He was a voracious, almost obsessive reader. While he had rejected formal education, he embarked on a passionate course of self-education. He became fascinated with the esoteric and the mystical, devouring the complex, often impenetrable works of occultists like Aleister Crowley and theosophists like Madame Blavatsky. He began to amass a large and serious library on these subjects, a secret life of the mind that few of his peers were even aware of. This intellectual curiosity ran parallel to his musical obsession. He was a collector, a connoisseur, a student of the craft. His record collection was his real school. He would spend hours listening, dissecting, and absorbing. He analyzed the stinging, melodic, and deceptively complex bass lines of the Beatles, particularly the foundational work of Paul McCartney. He immersed himself in the raw, earthy power of American bluesmen like John Lee Hooker, feeling the primordial rhythm in his bones. He was creating a persona for himself piece by piece, the long, often dyed orange hair, the impossibly tight Levi's, the beat-up yellow Corvair he drove around town. It was a carefully constructed identity, part working-class rebel, part enigmatic scholar, and it set him apart from everyone. The dream of a life in music, which had been a passionate but abstract hobby, was about to crystallize into a concrete mission. In 1965, the same year he dropped out of school, he and Ron Asheton decided to embark on a pilgrimage. They were no longer content to experience the rock and roll revolution through vinyl records and radio waves. They wanted to go to the source. They pooled their money, bought a Triumph motorcycle, and set off for the Holy Land. London. Imagine the sheer audacity of it. Two teenagers from the quiet suburbs of Michigan, with little more than a motorcycle and a shared obsession, crossing the Atlantic to immerse themselves in the white-hot center of the cultural universe. Swinging London in 1965 was more than just a city. It was an idea, a vibrant technicolor explosion of fashion, art, and, above all, music. For Dave and Ron, arriving there must have been like landing on another planet. The air itself seemed to crackle with a new kind of energy. The fashion was outrageous. The streets pulsed with a rhythm that was entirely alien to them, and music poured from the doors of legendary clubs like the Marquee. Their stated goal was twofold: to see their heroes, The Who, perform live, and, in a fit of youthful optimism, to somehow find and meet the Beatles. They succeeded spectacularly on the first count. To witness The Who in 1965 was to witness a force of nature. It wasn't just a concert, it was a beautiful, violent spectacle. It was Pete Townshend's windmilling arm crashing down on his guitar, Keith Moon's manic octopus-like drumming, and the controlled chaos of it, all culminating in the ritualistic smashing of their instruments. For a kid from Ann Arbor, this was more than music. It was a vocabulary. The smashing of a guitar was no longer just destruction. It was a language for the frustration that, until then, had no words. They failed, of course, to find the Beatles, who were by then the most famous and inaccessible human beings on the planet. But in a chance encounter that felt like a cosmic seal of approval, they did bump into the Rolling Stones. In a story that has become a small piece of Stooges lore, Mick Jagger accidentally stepped on Ron Asheton's foot. While Ron was starstruck and fuming, Dave, ever the quiet observer, struck up a brief, surreal conversation with bassist Bill Wyman. We don't know what they said, but the significance of the moment is immense. He had spoken to one of them. He had breached the veil. That experience was a baptism by fire. The abstract dream had become tangible, real, and attainable. They returned to Ann Arbor not as the same kids who had left. The high school dropout now had a singular, all-consuming mission. The world of 9-to-5 jobs and suburban expectations was no longer just an undesirable option. It was an impossibility. He knew, with a kind of profound certainty that only youth can muster, what he was meant to do. He would be a musician. He would be the anchor, the foundation. He would play the bass. And he would start a band with his friends, a band that would be louder, harder, and more real than anything the world had ever seen before. The quiet, thoughtful kid from the west side of Ann Arbor was about to help invent a new kind of noise. The return from London was not a quiet re-entry. For Dave Alexander and Ron Asheton, the world had been fundamentally rewired. The mundane black and white reality of Ann Arbor now seemed impossibly small, a cage from which they had been briefly liberated, and to which they would not be returned without a fight. The pilgrimage had given them more than just memories. It had given them a mission, a tangible purpose that burned away the adolescent fog of boredom and rebellion. The abstract desire to make some noise had solidified into a concrete plan. They were no longer just misfits, they were founders. The raw materials were already there, scattered across the town's small insular music scene. Ron's brother, Scott Asheton, was a powerhouse drummer, a human engine of raw primal rhythm who hit the skins with the force and subtlety of a demolition crew. He was the rhythmic heartbeat they needed. And then there was Jim Osterberg. Osterberg was a known quantity in Ann Arbor, but one that nobody quite knew what to do with. A hyperactive, fiercely intelligent, and restlessly ambitious musician, he had been drumming for popular local bands like the Iguanas and later the Prime Movers, a respected blues outfit. But drumming was never going to be enough for him. It was a perch from which he could study the mechanics of a performance, but he was tired of being a spectator to his own ambitions. The true lightning bolt moment for him had come on a trip to Chicago, where he witnessed The Doors perform live. Watching the shamanistic, confrontational, and dangerously charismatic stage presence of Jim Morrison was more than just an inspiration. It was a revelation. Osterberg saw a path forward. He didn't want to be the guy keeping time in the back anymore. He wanted to be at the very edge of the stage, a lightning rod, a conduit for something wild and untamed. When Dave and the Ashetons finally joined forces with Osterberg in 1967, it was a volatile and perfect chemical reaction. 4 distinct strains of suburban frustration and artistic ambition collided. They began rehearsing in the Ashetons' mother's basement, a cramped, chaotic space that would become the unlikely laboratory for a new kind of sound. Osterberg, who would soon rechristen himself with the now legendary moniker Iggy Pop, was the undeniable frontman. But Dave Alexander, in his own quiet, stoic way, was the band's ideological and sonic anchor. Their early sound was a conscious and violent rejection of everything that was happening in popular music, as the rest of the world was embracing the intricate, paisley-draped psychedelia and peace and love ethos of the Summer of Love. This quartet from the industrial Midwest was stripping music down to its most brutal and elemental components. They were not interested in writing songs about flowers and spiritual enlightenment. They weren't writing songs. They were building machines out of noise, machines that replicated the sound of a Detroit assembly line, that ran on the fuel of suburban boredom, and that screamed with the rage of being young, smart, and powerless. Dave's role in crafting this sound was both paradoxical and essential. He had only been playing the bass for a few months. He had no formal training and little technical skill. In any other context, this would have been a crippling liability. For the Stooges, it became their greatest strength. His lack of conventional experience liberated him from the established rules of the instrument. He couldn't play flashy, melodic runs, so he didn't. Instead, he created bass lines of a monstrous, hypnotic simplicity. He played the bass not as a musical instrument, but as a tool of hypnosis. He would find a single, brutal note and drive it like a railroad spike into the song's core, pinning everything to its unholy rhythm. He locked in telepathically with Scott Asheton's drumming, and together they created a rhythmic foundation that was less a groove and more a monolithic slab of concrete. This was Dave's genius. He understood instinctively that his job was not to decorate the music, but to contain it. He created an unshakable center of gravity, a musical eye of the storm around which the true chaos could safely spin. It was his stoic, unmoving presence and his repetitive, trance-inducing bass lines that allowed Ron Asheton's fuzzed-out, proto-metal guitar squalls and Iggy Pop's unhinged, acrobatic, and increasingly self-destructive stage antics to flourish. Without Dave's foundation, the band's sound would have been nothing but noise. With it, it became something terrifying, new, and profound. They called themselves the Psychedelic Stooges at first, a sarcastic nod to the prevailing trend, but soon shortened it to the far more fitting and self-deprecating name, the Stooges. Their early live shows were bizarre, avant-garde happenings. They would fill the stage with strange homemade instruments, vacuum cleaners, oil drums, anything that could make a jarring industrial noise. Iggy, not yet the bare-chested icon he would become, would perform in a white-face mime getup, a strange alien presence. And through it all, there was Dave, a gravitational pull of calm, his long orange hair obscuring his face, his body swaying almost imperceptibly as he laid down the unholy groove. Their reputation as the most bizarre, confrontational, and utterly compelling live act in Michigan grew. It was this reputation that reached the ears of Danny Fields, an A&R man for Elektra Records, the hip, taste-making label that was home to the Doors. In a moment that has become legendary in the annals of the music industry, Fields flew to Detroit to see them in 1968. He was so taken with their concept, their energy, and their sheer unapologetic weirdness that he offered them a record deal on the spot, famously without even hearing them play a single conventional song. They were an idea whose time, against all odds, had come. In 1969, the Stooges were flown to New York City to record their debut album. The culture shock must have been immense. These were 4 kids from the quiet Midwest, now dropped into the swirling vortex of late 60s Manhattan. Their producer was John Cale, the Welsh multi-instrumentalist and avant-garde genius from the Velvet Underground, a band whose own brand of dark, street-level realism had been a key inspiration. On paper, it was a perfect match. The godfathers of New York cool, producing the next generation of Midwestern primitives. In reality, the sessions were a clash of worlds. Cale, with his formal training and experimental sensibilities, was both fascinated and occasionally frustrated by the band's beautiful, brutal simplicity. The Stooges, for their part, were suspicious of any attempt to clean up or intellectualize their sound. This tension came to a head in a now famous confrontation centered around Dave Alexander. As they were setting up to record, Cale, following standard studio practice, asked Dave to turn down his massive Sun bass amplifier. Dave, the quietest member of the band, the one least likely to cause a fuss, flatly refused. This was not just an act of petulant, drunken stubbornness, although alcohol was certainly a factor. It was a fierce and principled defense of the band's entire sonic philosophy. Dave understood on a visceral level that the Stooges' power did not come from clarity or separation. It came from overwhelming physical force. The bass wasn't supposed to be just another instrument in the mix. It was supposed to be a wave of low-end energy that hit you in the chest, that vibrated through the floor and into your bones. To turn it down would be to compromise, to domesticate the very beast they had come to unleash. He held his ground, and in doing so, he won the battle for the soul of the record. The result was an album that sounds less like a carefully crafted studio document and more like a contained industrial accident. It is the sound of sonic overload, a wall of beautiful, distorted noise that, at the time, baffled critics, but would go on to become the sacred text for every punk rock band that followed. On that debut album, Dave's contributions were immense. He received co-writing credits on several tracks, including the iconic sludge rock anthems I Wanna Be Your Dog and No Fun. His bass lines on these songs are studies in brutalist minimalism, the sound of a simple idea executed with absolute, unshakable conviction. But it was on the album's closer, the haunting 8-minute drone epic We Will Fall, that the hidden depths of his artistry were laid bare. The track, largely his own composition, is unlike anything else in the band's catalog. It is a dark, mystical incantation, a hypnotic chant set against a backdrop of viola, droning feedback, and Iggy's repetitive mantra-like vocals. Drawing heavily from his deep interest in the occult and esoteric literature, The song revealed the secret identity of the band's quiet bassist. He was not just a punk, he was a poet, a hidden intellectual, the occult heart of the entire operation. With the album released, the band hit the road, and their legend began to grow exponentially. A Stooges live show in 1969 and 1970 was not a passive musical experience. It was a genuine, high-stakes confrontation. It was a space where the invisible wall between performer and audience was not just broken, but violently shattered. Iggy, now fully embracing his persona as a raw-powered force of nature, would smear himself with peanut butter, roll in broken glass, and dive headfirst into the crowd, a writhing, bare-chested dervish of pure, id-driven energy. And through all this glorious, terrifying chaos, Dave Alexander remained the stoic, monolithic core. He was the eye of the hurricane, a strangely calm and unmoving presence, often with his back to the audience, lost in the monstrous, hypnotic groove he and Scott Ashton were creating. This was the strange duality of Dave Alexander during the band's ascent. On stage, he was a pillar of strength, the reliable, unshakable foundation. Off stage, however, the alcoholism that had been a constant companion since childhood was beginning to spiral into a full-blown crisis. The drinking was no longer just a part of his life, it was becoming his entire life. For a time, he managed to walk the impossibly fine line of the functioning alcoholic. The drinking was part of the ritual, part of the outlaw image, a fuel for the nihilistic fire. But those who were close to him could see the toll it was taking. The quiet, witty intellectual was increasingly being consumed by a sullen, unpredictable drunk. The balance was precarious and it could not hold. Before it all fell apart, however, they had one more masterpiece to create. In 1970, they entered the studio to record their second album, the record that would become their magnum opus, Funhouse. If their debut was a threat, Funhouse was the crime itself. To this day, it remains less an album to be listened to and more a physical space to be entered. A relentless, claustrophobic, and exhilarating document of a band at the absolute zenith of its telepathic powers. To capture their explosive live energy, the producer Don Gallucci made the unorthodox decision to record the band as if they were playing a gig. They set up in one large room at Elektra Sound Recorders in Los Angeles, with no sound baffles or separation between the instruments, and with Iggy singing through a handheld microphone. They were essentially recording a live album in a studio setting, and the result was pure lightning in a bottle. And on this, their greatest recorded achievement, Dave Alexander's artistry came into its full, magnificent flower. This was his album. He was no longer just the anchor. He was a primary creative force, the chief architect of the album's dark, menacing, and deeply funky atmosphere. He was the primary writer of the sludgy, epic masterpiece Dirt. His bass line, a slow, narcotic, predatory crawl that defines the track's malevolent mood. He co-wrote the album's explosive closing track, L.A. Blues, a descent into pure, atonal chaos. His driving staccato riff on the proto-punk anthem 1970 is a masterclass in aggressive rhythm, but his crowning achievement is the album's opener, the iconic Down on the Street. His bass line is not just a riff, it is a statement of intent, a taut, coiled, impossibly cool groove that struts and swaggers with a dangerous confidence. It is one of the single greatest bass lines in the history of rock and roll, a groove that stands as a testament to the raw genius of a man who was, by this point, beginning to be consumed by his demons. On tracks like TVI, his playing had evolved from simple foundational support into a lead instrument, his bass delivering a series of jabbing, percussive punches that were as crucial to the song's impact as the guitar riff or the vocal melody. For this brief, brilliant moment in the spring of 1970, Dave Alexander was not just a member of the band. He was its musical soul. Funhouse was complete. They had done it. They had created a perfect, uncompromising document of their sound, a magnum opus of primal fury. They were, without question, one of the most powerful and important rock and roll bands on the planet. They stood on the precipice of a new level of recognition, their influence beginning to seep into the consciousness of a new generation of musicians. The future, which had once seemed like an impossibility, now seemed limitless. But the same creative fire that had produced this masterpiece was also burning them alive. The lifestyle of relentless touring and profound substance abuse was exacting a heavy price. For Dave Alexander, the bill was about to come due. The stage was set for their biggest show to date, a triumphant homecoming at a massive festival. The stakes had never been higher, and the fall was coming faster than any of them could have possibly imagined. The summer of 1970 should have been the Stooges' coronation. With Funhouse, their astonishing and terrifying masterpiece, complete and ready for release, they were no longer just a cult act from the fringes of the American Midwest. They were a force of nature, a band operating at the absolute peak of their creative and destructive powers. They had harnessed a sound that no one had ever heard before, and the world, whether it was ready or not, was beginning to take notice. The perfect stage for their ascension was set. The Goose Lake International Music Festival, held in their home state of Michigan in early August. This was not just another gig. Goose Lake was Michigan's answer to Woodstock, a massive multi-day event that drew hundreds of thousands of fans. It was a pilgrimage for the counterculture, and a headline slot for the Stooges was a profound validation. This was their triumphant homecoming, a chance to stand before a vast sea of their own people and claim their rightful place in the rock and roll pantheon. The pressure was immense. This was the moment to prove that their confrontational avant-garde noise was not just a club act, but a phenomenon capable of captivating a festival-sized audience. For Dave Alexander, it was supposed to be the culmination of the dream that had begun 5 years earlier on the streets of London. Instead, it would be his public execution. The backstage atmosphere at a festival like Goose Lake is a swirling vortex of chaos, a mixture of nervous energy, professional pressure, and rampant indulgence. For a band as famously hard-living as the Stooges, it was a dangerously permissive environment. By the time they were due on stage on the evening of August 8th, Dave Alexander was, by all accounts, in no condition to perform. The exact cause of his incapacitation remains a point of tragic debate, a murky detail in a story full of them. He was, without question, profoundly drunk, but many close to the band, including Ron Asheton, have long maintained that it was more than just alcohol. The exact cause of his incapacitation remains a point of tragic debate. He was, without question, profoundly drunk. However, Ron Asheton, for the rest of his life, maintained the belief that it was more than just alcohol, leading to the persistent rumor that Dave was unknowingly dosed. Whether he was simply a victim of his own chronic disease or the victim of a cruel prank, the result was the same. He was beyond the point of no return. As the band took the massive stage, stepping into the bright, hot glare of the festival lights, it was immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. Dave stumbled to his spot, his bass hanging from his shoulder like a dead weight, and then he froze. Imagine the horror of that moment. You are standing in front of the largest crowd of your life. The roar is deafening. The lights are blinding. This is the single most important performance of your career. And your body, your mind, your very being betrays you. You cannot remember the notes. You cannot command your fingers to move. You are a ghost in your own skin, a passenger in a catastrophic slow-motion crash. As Iggy, Ron, and Scott launched into the opening number, Dave just stood there paralyzed. A hollow, gaping sonic hole opened up where his thunderous foundational bass lines should have been. The stoic center of the hurricane had dissolved. The other members played on, a mixture of confusion, fury, and dawning horror on their faces. They tried to cover for him, to power through, but the damage was done. The Stooges' legendary power was built on the telepathic lock between the four of them, and with one pillar gone, the entire temple crumbled. The set was a disaster, a public and humiliating breakdown on the biggest stage they had ever occupied. In the brutal, unforgiving world of rock and roll, there is no appeal process for a failure of that magnitude. The decision was swift, clinical, and merciless. A few days after the Goose Lake debacle, Iggy Pop, the frontman and de facto leader, the man who had been Dave's friend since their teenage years, fired him from the band. There was no room for sentiment. His powerful, minimalist bass lines became the essential blueprint for generations of punk and alternative musicians who followed, many of whom studied his work without even knowing his name. Furthermore, it was later revealed by guitarist Ron Asheton that much of Iggy Pop's iconic intellectual and sarcastic persona was directly borrowed from Alexander, positioning him not just as the band's musical anchor, but as its silent muse. For many years, the only public eulogy was a single stark line in Iggy Pop's song Dum Dum Boys, OD'd on alcohol. It was a brutally honest acknowledgement from the man who had fired him. Formal recognition finally arrived in 2010 when the Stooges were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. During the ceremony, Iggy Pop publicly honored Alexander's foundational role, and Mike Watt, who played bass for the reunited band, paid his own tribute by wearing a shirt with Dave's face at every performance. Dave Alexander's story is the ultimate testament of the silent architect, the one who draws the blueprints and lays the foundation, only to be erased from the history of the building. He was an indispensable ingredient who helped change music forever, but was ultimately consumed by the very revolution he helped create. His absence leaves behind a legacy of haunting bass lines and the lingering unanswered question of what if. The Stooges, as a professional entity, were fighting for survival, and Dave had become a liability they could no longer afford. The firing was not just the loss of a job, it was a profound act of identity erasure. In an instant, he was no longer Dave Alexander, bassist for the Stooges. He was just Dave. The mission that had defined his entire adult life, the singular purpose that had driven him since his return from London, was over. He had been cast out of the chaotic, dysfunctional family he had helped create. At the age of 23, his career was finished. The architect had been banished from his own creation. As the machine he built roared on without him, he was left to wander the quiet streets of his hometown, a man suddenly deafened by the silence. To be an exile in your own hometown is a peculiar and painful kind of hell. Dave Alexander never left Ann Arbor. He never joined another band, never made a serious attempt to get back into the music industry. He simply drifted. He became a ghost in his own life story, a local legend and a cautionary tale, haunting the same streets and bars that had once been his kingdom. In a fascinating and heartbreaking twist often recounted by his friends, he demonstrated that the sharp, analytical mind that had once curated a library of occult literature was still very much alive. He reportedly took the money he had earned during his time in the band and made a series of surprisingly shrewd and successful investments in the stock market. This small financial cushion allowed him to live without working, but it also enabled his aimless, anchorless existence. It was the ultimate contradiction. He was intellectually capable of navigating the complex world of finance, but completely incapable of navigating the treacherous terrain of his own addiction. He could manage a stock portfolio, but he could not manage to save his own life. His days fell into a patternless pattern of collecting books and records, of pursuing his intellectual interests in private, and of sinking ever deeper into the suffocating fog of his alcoholism. The one constant, the one true lifeline in these lost years was his unwavering friendship with the Asheton brothers. Their bond, forged in the fires of adolescent rebellion, transcended the brutal politics of the band. Even after the Stooges had gone through other lineups and eventually dissolved, Ron and Scott remained fiercely loyal to their lost friend. They hung out with him, they looked out for him, and they bore witness to his slow, tragic decline. Their loyalty is the human core of this story, a testament to a friendship that endured even as the man at its center was disappearing. Friends from that period describe a man of heartbreaking dualities. In moments of sobriety, he was still the Dave they had always known, incredibly intelligent, with a wry, savage, and deeply sarcastic sense of humor. He was still a brilliant conversationalist, a man with a rich interior life. But these moments became fewer and farther between. More often, he was the other Dave, the sullen, unpredictable, and profoundly sad drunk, a man being methodically dismantled by his disease. The quiet mystery that had once been so alluring on stage had curdled into a lonely, impenetrable isolation. He was a shell of his former self, haunted by the ghost of the rock star he almost was. The physical toll of chronic, severe alcoholism is not poetic or romantic. It is a slow, grinding, and ugly process of bodily decay. By the early 1970s, Dave was diagnosed with pancreatitis, a brutally painful and debilitating inflammation of the pancreas that is a common consequence of long-term alcohol abuse. His life became a revolving door of hospital stays. Each visit was a temporary reprieve, a chance to dry out and reset, but the pull of the bottle was always stronger than the fear of death. He was caught in a vicious downward spiral, and he was either unwilling or unable to break free. On February 10, 1975, in a hospital in Ann Arbor, the spiral finally reached its inevitable end. Dave Alexander died. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs fill with fluid, which was a direct and brutal consequence of the pancreatitis that had ravaged his body. He was 27 years old. The death of Stooges bassist Dave Alexander was as quiet and lonely as the final years of his life. Though he is technically a member of the infamous 27 Club, his story has long been treated as a mere footnote. He was denied the dramatic exit demanded by rock and roll mythology. Instead of a fiery overdose or a tragic crash, he succumbed to alcoholism, a disease too slow and mundane for the legend-making machine. As a result, his contributions were largely erased for decades, overshadowed by the louder narrative of Iggy and the Stooges. However, a contribution so profound could not remain buried forever. His true legacy was etched into the grooves of the first two Stooges albums,